The pencil moved across the page in secret, recording thoughts that could have meant imprisonment within a prison. Railroad Street and Mexia, Texas, stretched before them on that June evening in 1943. But it was the lights that stopped Unafitzia Verer Burkhart cold. Through the windows of their passenger train, nearly 2,000 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps witnessed something impossible. Every building blazed with electric light, not dim bulbs rationed and controlled, but floods of illumination pouring from farmhouses, shops, street corners. An entire constellation of electricity flowing across the Texas landscape at 10 o'clock at night, as if energy itself cost nothing. Burkhart's hand trembled as he wrote what he dared not speak aloud. The propaganda must be lies. No nation fighting on two fronts could possess such abundance. Back home in Germany, blackout regulations had extinguished the cities since 1940. Even before the war, barely 1 farm in 5 had electrical power. Yet here, in what Berlin had described as a decadent, crumbling America, electricity seemed as common as air. The journey that brought them to this moment had begun with defeat. Tunisia, May 13, 1943. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered what remained of the Afrika Korps, somewhere between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The exact count lost in the chaos as scattered units gave up over several days. These were the men who had driven the British back to Egypt, who had earned Montgomery's grudging respect. Now they were captives. Among them stood Hauptmann Friedrich Rodka, holder of the Iron Cross, veteran of France, twice wounded in the desert. His diary, discovered decades later buried in the National Archives, would chronicle something unexpected. Not the suffering of captivity, but the shattering of everything he thought he knew about the world. The processing began in Oran, Algeria. 30,000 prisoners waited in temporary camps for the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. Already, the carefully constructed image of American incompetence was beginning to crack. The Americans handled thousands daily with organizational precision that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had managed even at its peak. Identity cards, photographs, medical examinations, inoculations, Geneva Convention rights explained in flawless German by officers trained specifically for this task. Then came the food. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, would later write to his mother about those first meals. In the cage at Oran, while waiting for transport, the Americans fed them better than they had eaten during 6 months of desert combat. White bread, actual coffee, meat twice daily. They assumed it was propaganda, a show to impress them. They didn't yet understand this was standard military ration. The Liberty ships themselves told a story, though the prisoners didn't know how to read it yet. The SS Robert E. Peary had been constructed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California. These vessels, produced at a rate of 3 per day during peak output, were returning empty from European supply runs. Rather than waste the voyage, they carried human cargo, up to 30,000 prisoners monthly by summer 1943. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept meticulous notes during the 2-week Atlantic crossing in July. The ship's crew, he observed, threw away more food each day than his entire company received in weekly rations during their final months in Africa. American sailors disposed of half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long. They did this openly, without thought, not to mock their prisoners, but because the waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. The ships themselves became classrooms. Prisoners discovered they were traveling on one of 2,700 Liberty ships that would be built during the war. Each vessel required 250,000 parts assembled from components manufactured across 32 states. The engines came from 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled in ports that barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Steborn, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge as they approached the American coast. This technology, which they believed only Germany and perhaps Britain possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then, he would later write, that he first suspected Germany had already lost the war. Norfolk Naval Base sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching for miles. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than Hamburg managed in a week. Gefreiter Johann Weber counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany, moving smoothly with electric power, continuously, without the coal smoke that choked German industrial cities. They marched past parking lots filled with automobiles, hundreds of them belonging to dock workers. In Germany, private car ownership remained a privilege of wealth and party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the people since 1934, remained a propaganda dream with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians. Here, ordinary laborers drove to work in their own vehicles. But nothing prepared them for the trains. Not boxcars, not the 40 and 8 wagons that had carried German troops across Europe, but full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with potted seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. They boarded like tourists, not prisoners, Hauptmann Rodke recorded. One American sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly. Air conditioning! In August, they had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train. The 3-day journey from Norfolk to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma would demolish Nazi ideology more effectively than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, prisoners pressed faces against windows, witnessing an America that couldn't exist according to everything they had been taught. Every small town blazed with light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany would be fortunate to have a single electric street lamp, displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, parking lots full even at midnight. Obergefreiter Meyer, whose father was a Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered years later about that first night. They passed through dozens of cities, each with more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told them this was normal, that every American town had been electrified since the 20s. He called them liars. They just shrugged and said he would see. In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. American railway workers performed in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. Every aspect demonstrated technological superiority. More disturbing still was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties into bins without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished. Feldwebel Henrik Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they stopped in consumed more electricity in 1 hour than his entire Berlin district used in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. As the trains crossed Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered American industrial power fully displayed. Through the windows, they watched endless factories, each larger than anything most had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming more power than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the train slowed past the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, understood immediately. In a post-war interview, he recalled knowing those plants, seeing the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything they had built, and there were dozens more just in this one location. They told him there were dozens more across the country. They passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from over 1.5 million parts manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant consumed more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne.
Hauptmann Wehler, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion, visible from the train. They had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat. But he could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of construction. These were not inferior aircraft, they were simply built faster than seemed possible. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River while below them barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. Prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks, each holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote that the Americans transported food as they transported ammunition, in endless quantities without concern for loss. He watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed his entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than their weekly ration. In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell of meat-packing plants filled the air for miles. German prisoners who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, when lucky, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during their lunch break. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread. The guard bought them hamburgers from a stand near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 without thinking, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not special, this was their normal food. The camps themselves provided the next level of cognitive demolition. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astounded medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberstarzt Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies unavailable in Germany since 1941. All standard provision for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify. This miracle drug they had only heard rumors about. The Americans used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving them their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for 5,000 men. Daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote about throwing away more food than his family had seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. American regulations required they prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner received full rations. The surplus was discarded. He wept as he threw perfectly good bread into garbage. By September 1943, labor shortages in American agriculture led to the employment of prisoners in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have handled in a month using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of rural electrification that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, Lang recorded. Not aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including the Negroes, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week, and this was normal. Every farm they passed was the same. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields, witnessing agricultural mechanization that defied comprehension. A single combine harvester could do the work of 100 men. Fields stretched to the horizon, each larger than entire German counties. Farmers spoke casually of yields that would have been fantasy in Germany, 60 bushels of wheat per acre, compared to Germany's 30, on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote about the farmer's son, a boy of 16, driving a tractor worth more than everything his father had earned in his lifetime. When he mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even particularly good. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better. The most devastating revelations came to those who worked near American factories. At a Campbell Soup facility in New Jersey, prisoners watched production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in a month. The facility operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, as most young workers were in the military, yet production exceeded peacetime levels. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented the experience. Everything was automated. Electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers processing hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant gained glimpses of the automotive industry's conversion to war production. The River Rouge complex employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed more electricity daily than the entire city of Hamburg. They could see the parking lots, wrote Obergefreiter Keller. Thousands of cars belonging to workers. In Germany, even officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory workers drove to work. The guard told them many workers owned 2 cars, one for work, one for family use. They thought he was mocking them. By winter 1943, the cumulative impact of these observations was producing what American intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome among prisoners. The Special Projects Division, the secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's Office, documented increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Newland, a monitoring team member, reported in December 1943 that prisoners no longer argued when shown production statistics. They had seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis had become quiet. They still maintained loyalty to Germany, but no longer spoke of victory. Many openly questioned what they had been told about America. Camp newspapers produced by prisoners themselves began reflecting this transformation. Der Ruf, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors about being told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military prowess. Every day here, he wrote, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals. The most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: the treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Italian prisoners who agreed to cooperate were formed into service units, given better quarters, increased pay, and more freedom. German prisoners watched their former allies working alongside Americans, eating in American restaurants, some even dating American women. Hauptmann Schultz wrote about the Italians betraying them, yet being treated better than they had treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy they were taught to despise appears more honorable than their own system. Christmas 1943.
Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote about them knowing the prisoners were their enemies. Many had sons and husbands fighting against their armies, yet they showed Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power. The Christmas feast itself defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream. Quantities of food Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. Prisoners ate until they were sick, unable to comprehend such resources being lavished on enemies. They ate like kings, wrote Feldwebel Hans Mayer. Better than German generals ate, better than party leaders. And this was not special. Guards told them this was normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. Prisoners who had been told Americans were cultureless barbarians discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, scientific research that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints, something impossible in Nazi Germany. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote about American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, teaching them without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge with enemies. This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology. Camp theaters showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing depiction of American defeat and recovery that resonated with their own situation. They saw The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that Americans would show such self-criticism to enemies. They hide nothing, wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here, it is considered patriotic. Spring 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production reached peak. German prisoners worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing full might of American industrial capacity. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for D-Day. They watched workers assemble 700 boats monthly, each requiring 20,000 parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed production lines. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote about women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment. Everything they were told was impossible in a democracy, yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in a month than the entire German Navy built in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. Blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak. I worked at Krupp before the war, wrote Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann. I thought I understood industrial production, but this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel and spillage than we could produce with slave labor and double shifts. Workers complained about overtime while producing quantities we couldn't achieve with slave labor and double shifts. The summer 1944 harvest provided the final demolition of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, witnessing agricultural production that could feed the world. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvests, where single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships across an ocean of gold, each harvesting 100 acres per day. Grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Unterofficer Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote about one American farmer with machinery doing the work of 100 German farmers. They showed him aerial photographs of wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain prices, a concept that caused psychological breakdown among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. They destroyed food to keep prices stable, wrote Gefreiter Otto Schulz. Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to be allowed to send them to Germany, to our families. Guards were sympathetic, but explained it was impossible. The waste was strategic proof of unlimited resources. June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy invasion reached camps, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of the operation demonstrated American organizational capacity beyond Nazi Germany's wildest dreams. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave. Prisoners at Camp Shelby watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw endless streams of ships, artificial harbors, supply systems delivering 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight. Oberst Friedrich von Tauben wrote about knowing then that everything was lost. Not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. They had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. They sent horses against trucks, rifles against automatic weapons, courage against unlimited resources. Throughout captivity, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than any material wealth: American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and sentimental, prisoners discovered a people secure enough in their strength to show mercy. When Gefreiter Hans Mohr's son died in Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fischer's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany. Enemy civilians in a nation America was actively bombing. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Hartmann Otto. They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. This distinction, which seemed like propaganda, proved genuine. They prepared us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. Medical treatment particularly affected prisoners. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques, using advanced equipment. Prisoners received operations that would have been available only to elite in Germany. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was provided to traumatized soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote about them treating attempted suicides with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners with mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings. This humanity toward enemies revealed the strength they never understood, the confidence of true power. By March 1945, the secret re-education program had produced remarkable results. Over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers published articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war. The program's success exceeded expectations. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis were writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn oaths to Hitler were planning how to implement American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. They became missionaries for democracy, admitted Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarschall, in a 1975 interview. Not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. They saw it work. They saw ordinary people living better than German aristocracy. They wanted that for Germany. The transformation was so complete that American authorities worried about prisoners being too enthusiastic about American ways. Some requested to stay in America after the war. Others married American women they met through prisoner correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to America in the 50s.
The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had maintained some pride in German honor despite military defeat now faced complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they had fought for was not just defeated, but evil. Hauptmann Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. They thought they were warriors for a great cause. They discovered they were tools of criminals. They believed they were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. They found they were the barbarians. The Americans they called weak and decadent showed them what civilization actually meant. As the war ended in May 1945, German prisoners faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything they had believed. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity by enemies than by their own government. The last months of captivity were spent preparing for return to a destroyed Germany. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. Prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was announced, understanding that America would rebuild rather than punish Germany. They prepared us to rebuild our country, wrote Oberst Friedrich von Tauben. They gave us skills, knowledge, and hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens. This generosity from victors was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness. Between 1945 and 1946, over 371,000 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute, but they brought with them something precious:
knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. The German prisoners who experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They had seen industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic prosperity. They knew Reconstruction was possible because they had witnessed a society that had achieved it. Many former prisoners rose to prominence in West Germany's Reconstruction. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Como, became president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Weckmar, held at Camp Herne, served as German permanent representative to the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 50s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. They learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. They saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production. These lessons learned as prisoners shaped the new Germany. Historians have called the German prisoner experience in America one of the most successful re-education programs in history. Without coercion, without propaganda in the traditional sense, American industrial might and democracy converted hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. The program succeeded because it relied not on words, but on observation. Prisoners saw American society functioning at peak efficiency while treating enemies with dignity. They witnessed industrial capacity that made German production look primitive. They experienced a standard of living that exposed Nazi promises as fantasies. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German prisoners in America, concluded that America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prisoners were converted by prosperity. Of the 371,000 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with only 2,200 total attempts recorded. Post-war surveys showed 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German prisoners held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Obergefreiter Hans Weber, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to become a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the reunion. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. They discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, they discovered dignity. Former Stabsfabel Kurt Meyer, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added that the farmers treated them not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against them changed them forever. At the 1985 reunion dinner, former Oberst Hermann Gotz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of the transformation. They came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. They left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed them that strength comes not from conquest, but from production. Not from hatred, but from diversity. Not from tyranny, but from freedom. They witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. They saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. They learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. They returned to Germany with a mission to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. They who came as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends. Thank you for showing us the way.
The auditorium erupted in standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The story of German prisoners in America is ultimately a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration. Not through propaganda, but through prosperity. Not through hatred, but through humanity. The German soldiers who witnessed American industrial might became unwitting ambassadors of democracy, carrying back to their homeland the seeds of transformation that would bloom into one of history's most successful reconstructions. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history, accomplished not through force, but through the overwhelming evidence of what free people could achieve when they worked together. In the end, that was America's secret weapon. Not just the ability to produce more tanks and planes than any nation in history, but the capacity to transform enemies into friends through the simple power of example. The German prisoners were stunned by American industrial might, but more importantly, they were changed by it. And in that change lay the foundation for a better world.